Welcome to Narcolepsy Pumpkin.
In this episode, we're going to have a talk about characterization tests. What they are, why we need them, what we're supposed to do with them after we've refactored code. Basically a 101 of characterization tests. You'll see me use them throughout my refactoring videos. So it's one of the first steps I do when I approach anything that's to do with refactoring a piece of code that already exists. I write a set of characterization tests, try and get that as close to 90, maybe 85% code coverage, so that I'm fairly sure I've got most of the code paths in the piece of code I'm going to change covered before I dive in and make a mess.
What are they? Well, if you think of them in real world engineering terms, they're very much like a jig.
You use a jig in order to maintain distances between points while fabrication is taking place. And that's because metals, believe it or not, when they get hot, tend to distort. And welding, believe it or not, gets metal very hot. So while welding and grinding and drilling, you want to maintain that you aren't distorting or moving specific points. Hence, those are fixed to a jig. The jig is built before and tends to be over-engineered and incredibly rigid so that it can withstand a little bit more shifting about than the thing you are creating. A characterization test is very much the same principle, but in software. You are creating something that will hold the shape of your software while you fabricate or change its structure.
These tests don't tend to live beyond that refactor or beyond the transition. That's not always true. Sometimes characterization tests are absolutely good enough to run with going forward. But often it's worth revisiting those tests to make them into something that's a little more understandable.
The reason for having characterization tests is because we are human, and we, and I in particular, make a hell of a lot of mistakes, do some crazy things in code, and end up with it not working. Having characterization tests there to fall back on means that you can get back to a point where those tests pass and you're comfortable that everything is working as it did before, or at least the inputs and the outputs are there and doing the same thing.
One of the reasons why characterization tests are something we need to revisit after we've finished our transition or refactor of code is that they're often built without necessarily knowing the final structure that piece of code is going to be in, i.e. we try and put a test around the code in order to give some comfort that we've got inputs and outputs maintained during that refactor. That doesn't mean we actually know what the piece of code does, or necessarily that those characterization tests are asserting anything that is true. We often make the assumption that the piece of code works. It probably does, but we don't know of any defects that it may have. All we're doing is allowing ourselves to comfortably transition it to a form where we can detect, understand that code in order to move it forwards. So the characterization tests in themselves don't necessarily assert correctness. They just assert that the status quo is maintained.
If you've ever thought about, software, very different to building things out of metal. Why is it called engineering? I would ask you to go watch a little series, which I think is still going, called Project Binky. If you watch that, you'll see people do very similar things to we do with software, with physical bits of metal. i.e. creating what are in effect characterization tests for the structure of a vehicle, re-implementing structure of a vehicle so that it is implemented using different technologies. This isn't any different to the way we approach code, and it shows that in fact these principles do actually work in an engineering materials kind of world. However, the timescales required to take that approach are huge when you're talking about physical things. In software, we can chain things just like that. And that is the soft in software that's important. So in summary, we've covered what characterization tests are, why we use them, what principles they were originally kind of based on, where they came from, how long they should actually live for, and what the end goal of them actually is, i.e. they're there as long as we are refactoring their legacy code, and we aim to replace them with tests that better describe the behaviours of the code once we understand more about what they are.